All right, welcome to episode 30 of Seize the Moment podcast, and today we have a very special guest. Her name is Meg Van Deusen, PhD. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and mindfulness practitioner in private practice since 1994. She's worked with children, adolescents, and adults, both in inpatient and outpatient settings throughout the Los Angeles and Seattle areas. Her knowledge of and passion for attachment theory, mindfulness, interpersonal neurobiology, sleep, and dreams informs her belief that meaningful connection with ourselves and others helps us handle stress. She's here to talk today about her book that just came out called Stress in the US, 12 Tools to Tackle Anxiety, Loneliness, Tech Addiction, and More. Welcome, Meg. Hey.
Thanks for having me.
And Meg, so I was going through your book this past week, and man, there's like a million things that I want to talk about today, and I think Alen too. So the thing is, I don't know how much time we'll have, and I have like a million quotes with me. And so I actually want to start off by reading one of your quotes and asking you a question about it, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, so in her book, Meg writes, and this is referring to a quote by the author named Black Elk, who was a spiritual Native American author. And so Meg wrote, the above quote from Black Elk refers to the time when Native American tribes were dismantled by white men. I use it because I believe we are reliving in a time in which our attachments to each other and our nation are at risk of being dismantled yet again. When it comes down to it, what we have in this life is each other. We need each other not only to thrive, but to survive. So then my question is, Meg, in your assessment of kind of what's going on in the world, what do you feel like are the current barriers to healthy relationships?
Well, I think there's a lot going on, particularly in the U.S. So obviously the divisive political situation that we're living in has been, I think, particularly creating, a fair amount of stress for most Americans. I think we also have even bigger stressors that, for some people might be less conscious, but are nonetheless very real, such as the fact that the planet is dying. And so what we have known as our home, I think we're coming to terms with the fact it might not always be here. And that certainly, can rattle people and start to feel like if you don't have a home, then what are you connected to? Mm-hmm. I think, one of the more pervasive and daily variables that we're grappling with that affects our relationships with each other is technology. Mm-hmm. And, obviously technology has its benefits in numerous ways, but I think like many things, we found something new and cool with tech, and particularly with smartphones, and get very excited about inventions like that and forget to look at the dark side. And I just don't think that we were prepared for how much technology gets in the way of relationships. And I do think that we see that particularly in the Z generations, they are the ones that have really always had tech in their life and always had smartphones. And yet they really rank today as the loneliest generation in the U.S.
Yeah. And how do attachment styles factor in? So I guess my question would be, in terms of attachment styles, what are the attachment styles, and what are the prevalent attachment styles, or what is the most prevalent attachment style or styles that you're seeing and kind of in the world around us?
Well, actually, I think that's changing. So we have secure attachment. So attachment theory is based on John Bowlby's work. He was a British psychoanalyst in the 1950s. Worked for decades doing research on trying to understand what creates a sense of well-being, what creates good human development, and really looked at the relationship that infants and toddlers and children have with their caregivers, and really found that what's called secure attachment is dependent upon the way in which one's caregivers, interacts with the baby. Mm-hmm. So if there is a consistent and caring and soothing and available caregiver within reason, then the infant is likely to grow up with a secure attachment style. Other attachment styles that Bowlby discovered, and also with his work with Mary Ainsworth, were ambivalent attachment styles, which really is a person who is longing for, really desiring, is quite anxious to have mirroring or attention or fulfillment of needs from another human being. But then when that person receives some comforting or, presence of another human, might actually resist that person. So that's why it's called ambivalent. There's a desire for, but at the same time, a fear of close relationship. You have dismissive avoidant attachment style, which is actually people who deny that they need people at all. And so, you might have that in somebody who basically feels quite independent, doesn't feel the need to be in many relationships, or certainly not many close relationships, feels they're just fine, when in fact that isn't actually true. So often with dismissive avoidant types, we find that there is a significant amount of depression and loneliness. And then, depending on the theorists, a lot of people break these attachment styles down into, all different sort of nuanced types. So anxious, preoccupied, anxious, resistant, fearful, avoidant, dismissive, avoidant. But I think for the sake of being, just simple and to try to explain it clearly, I'm really looking at in the book secure attachment versus insecure attachment. And then what, the anxious type versus the avoidant type in the insecure. There's also a disorganized type. I don't talk about that as much. There are people who really grow up with very abusive parents, and where the inconsistency was not just about a parent being critical and then loving, but really quite much more traumatic than that.
And to bring it back to that example earlier about technology, it is the case that we're overly stimulated. That, for example, with the amount of time that people use their phones in the day. For example, I believe there was some sort of statistic that you cited regarding teens, where if a teen used their phone 5 or more hours a day, they were more likely to be, I believe, forgive me if I'm forgetting, stressed or depressed. And then if somebody used it, depressed. And then if they used it 1 hour a day, they were less likely to be that. But in the case of teens, that's not going to really happen because they're kind of glued to their smartphones.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so, what we're left with is we're really going to have to intervene on this ourselves. It's about engineering ways to set boundaries around technologies, not just for your teens or for your younger children, but for yourself. It's true for adults as well. There's a lot in my practice. There's the bottom line is smartphones are addictive. And the reason that they're addictive is because they set off the dopamine response. Makes you want to go back for more. And so they're doing two things. On the one hand, they're setting off a stress response every time it dings and rings and buzzes and all of that. It actually creates sort of an alert, right, that gets us hyper vigilant. And that's creating a bit of a stress response. There's also the fact that, with social media, people get likes and people get messages, and teens really respond to that in a kind of a mirror me sort of way that sets off the dopamine response. So what I've seen in my practice, and what many other practitioners that I know have seen as well, is the fact that the smartphone has now become a source of addiction, and that we've often had to work with people with regard to their use of the smartphone as if we were working with somebody who was addicted to drugs.
Yeah.
Wow.
And what do you think is, I guess, the attachment style or the connection between attachment styles and addictiveness in terms of, I guess, social media use, but also just tech use as a whole?
Well, I mean, I think that there it's definitely an insecure attachment. I mean, that definitely, there's a looking for, and particularly with regard to social media, there's looking for connection. There's a desire, a craving of connection, a preoccupation, if you will, with needing connection. Securely attached people don't necessarily have that level of preoccupation with or anxiety around needing attachment. And so people who are anxiously, constantly looking at their phones are really looking for connection. I think one of the things, though, that's happening is that technology may be contributing to, more of an avoidant attachment, particularly within the Z gens, because, so many of them get together less in person, and that's a fact. They're having virtual relationships, and so it makes it then difficult when they become used to just communicating virtually, especially their intimate feelings, to actually feel safe, in the flesh with somebody. And so there's a tendency more to avoid that.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about your book is that you actually are trying to seek ways of tackling the issue. For instance, I mean, you're right. It's something that technology, the way we know it now, our relationship to it now, has never been before seen. It's not something that we're used to, right? I mean, if you wanted to fill up your day with 24 hours of, well, not 24, you have to sleep, but barring that, if you wanted to fill up your day with whatever content from the internet, you really could. And what's funny is you'd have to be very selective with what you fill your day with, even if you try to do something like that, because there's too much content out there, which is why it makes sense to set boundaries on yourself, like for maybe how much time you spend on the internet or on social media or communicating by texting or and I believe there was I was going to say this later, but it just came into my mind now. Why not? So I believe there was something that was mentioned in terms of children having less screen time at schools. I believe there was something where you'd said it would be a good idea if weekly, like once a week, there would be days where students wouldn't use iPads or any sort of technology at all, just to kind of build those intimate relationships with each other and with the teacher as well in the classroom. This way, they're not always on their,
on their tablets,
and
correct.
such.
Yeah, correct. I mean, I think and I think that we've seen that in the Oakland public school system, where they were the first public school system, I believe, to introduce what's called Restorative Justice. And while that is a program really designed to help reduce, expulsions and suspensions and acting out behavior, essentially, among adolescents and younger kids, it also has, I think, a great benefit in terms of creating a sense of security. There really hasn't been much research done on, does restorative justice create a more secure attachment among students with their school. But my hypothesis would be that it would, because what it really is based on is what are called circle groups, and this is based on some tribal practices where the entire school is involved. It's a system change, it's the perspective change, and the students and the administration and the teachers gather in circle groups, really the aim is to create very safe spaces for people to be honest, open, vulnerable with one another, so that there's less of a hierarchical feeling where somebody's feeling less than intimidated by. And as a result of, this type of practice, expulsions and suspensions in the Oakland Public School District have been greatly reduced. It's been a highly successful program.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's good. That means that actually these ideas are gaining momentum, right?
Yeah.
Once upon a time, I'm sure people have had this vision years before I did, but even I don't know, 10 years ago, I was thinking, oh, it'd be great if meditation were taught in schools.
Yeah.
Things like that, or perhaps teaching people critical thinking skills, about nuance and thinking styles and things like that. And in a way, we do teach critical reading in schools. I wouldn't say I was not taught that, but it is interesting how these ideas nowadays are gaining way more momentum, and it's interesting to see what's going to happen even years from now, actually, as far as that goes. So, yeah.
And so, just in terms of the connection between social media and kind of different attachment styles, Meg, there was something that really kind of profoundly stood out to me, something you wrote in your book. And so you talked about having personas. So in kind of just psychology as a whole, and the things that Alen and I a lot of the time talk about, and just things that I deal with my clients, with just my friends, sort of people in general, is sort of how do you develop intimacy? And what is intimacy? How does one pretty much kind of develop or foster a connection with a human being seen and known and really loved for who they actually are? And so what happens for us as human beings a lot of the times, because, and this is not social media, I think, is more of a symptom of it than the actual problem, because we've been sort of wearing masks for years, right, in terms of kind of society and social roles. And so we try to develop these personas in order for the kind of tribes around us to accept us and to admire us and to kind of put us up on a pedestal, because in some way in our kind of deeper psyche, more sort of more primitive psyche, we know that kind of in order to be accepted, in order to survive, right, we have to sort of have a higher place kind of in the hierarchy in society. And something that Meg wrote in her book, she wrote in discussion or in sort of in her kind of elucidation of what a persona is. So she wrote, a persona is like a role or character one adopts in order to present what she or he thinks is a positive, likable image of herself to the world. Think of it as a mask that conveys a simple, captivating face while hiding the more complex, true one. And so, Meg, I wonder from you and from your perspective, what do you think it would be like if a person's entire life was just that, was just sort of this mask, and kind of their entire kind of world was just wrapped up in a well-curated Instagram page, where they felt like the only way that they could achieve happiness was to actually become something that they aren't, this sort of idealistic image that's presented to the world in this very kind of bubble-wrapped way, or gift-wrapped way?
Yeah, I think we're seeing that already, and I think that, what happens, loneliness, depression, anxiety, and estrangement from the self, and insecurity in the self, just, perpetuating a problem, because that all of those things would make it then harder to go out and truly attach to other people. Lonely people in particular. So the more you're hiding behind a persona, the less able you are to be your true self. That produces a lot of tension, first of all. It's stressful.
Yeah.
You have to keep up the image, and therefore you have to maintain a vigilance, really, to make sure there are no cracks in the image. So, number one, it's stressful, but number two, it's lonely, and lonely people, typically loneliness is based on perception. It's not based on how many people you actually have in your life. But lonely people are less likely to connect with others, to go out and meet people and talk in any kind of real way, because their assumption is that they're flawed.
Yeah.
And that, that they're in a one-down position, and that they're going to get rejected, and it's scary for them. So I think that the, persona-based lifestyle that social media certainly is a platform for, has an adverse effect in the sense that it can perpetuate loneliness and perpetuate these, deep-seated fears that somehow one is flawed behind the mask and therefore not acceptable.
Yeah, and in connection to stress reduction, or in connection just to stress in general, what do you feel is the connection between the mask, or the mask and the persona, to kind of an overall, or one's overall, or kind of, persistent sense of anxiety?
Well, because what makes us feel safe in the world is acceptance. And if we don't feel accepted for who we are, if we feel like we have to maintain the quote-unquote mask all the time, or we don't feel accepted for our true selves, we don't feel safe. And when we don't feel safe, that sets off the stress response. And what I'm talking about here is a more chronic stress response, right? A response that, a kid can spend hours on social media in their room and then have to get up and go to school the next day. And just that act can be stressful for them, now they're having to interact with people in the flesh, and it's a switch. It's a different kind of feeling. So, it causes people to maintain a vigilance and to try to maintain the same image that they had on social media when they're out in the world among other people in the flesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this facade, as you said, it wears on you. How long can you really maintain a facade like that, versus how will you feel while maintaining it? I'm sure in the beginning it's not so bad, but then as time goes on, that can have cascading effects. One, on just how you feel. Two, on how you interact with others. It could affect virtually everything.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's what minority groups have felt forever here in the States, and that is not accepted for who they are. And so they've always lived with some degree of stress. I think it's particularly heightened right now, given what's happening politically.
Yeah.
But, it's akin to that in a way when we think about, how groups of people who have been discriminated against, fear being out in the world for that reason. And many have feared for their lives for understandable reason. Now, social media is not that threatening, but it has the effect of making you feel as if, who you truly are is not accepted. And that's kind of the bottom line.
Yeah, wow, and it's interesting that you bring that up because, one of the biggest struggles that I have with my own clients is internalized racism. So, I remember a client telling me about sort of what it was like when she was younger, that, pretty much there was just Hollywood, right? So she said, kind of like we would see whatever on television or in the movies, what beauty was. And she's like, but now it's in your face all the time. So for her, she's like, because, I'm a part or a member of a minority group, she's like, for me, right, I constantly feel as though I'm ugly. And then it's like, before I was reminded about this every time I was in the movies or every time I was watching television, but now I'm reminded about it every single day when I'm on my phone, when I'm scrolling through social media. So when we started examining why she felt ugly, that was really it. It was because her features were not the features of kind of the sort of the pinnacle of kind of Caucasian beauty, and it was because that they weren't, right, so they didn't resemble them at all. And so the kind of work that we did in this sort of the idea that we tried to kind of create, or I guess the question that we try to answer was, can one be beautiful without meeting a particular standard of beauty in a particular time period in a particular culture? So what's so interesting is that when we kind of look at Instagram and these very well curated pages, what we see is kind of the pinnacle of what we're supposed to be. And in some way people kind of internalize that, and they say, well, it's either I try to find a way to adapt to this particular style or this particular what would you call it, this particular form of beauty, or I'll never be that. And if I'm not beautiful, then what am I? Then I must be ugly. So, Meg, have you ever found that in your work?
Oh, yeah, all the time. All the time. And, I think, again, and I write about this in the book, I think with, a lot of the stress that Americans are experiencing now and the divisive culture that we live in, and particularly with, an apparent rise in white supremacy. My minority clients, my ethnic minority clients, my immigrant clients, my gay and lesbian clients are particularly stressed out because to them the world has become less safe, even than it was 4 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think it's just because of this constant, how should I say, all these not necessarily sound bites, but there are a lot of things that that are done on the news, particularly to just kind of push on these buttons that kind of trigger your attention. whether it's somebody on the left, saying somebody on the right is wrong and why they're wrong, or the opposite, and just kind of
polarizing.
Yeah, and just kind of I don't know. Is it the media? Would you say it's like I wouldn't say they're to blame.
The media is great in many ways. I mean, journalism is great in many ways, and I think that it's one of the great privileges we have in the States is a free press. Yeah. But I do think that because of information overload, because of what you guys were saying before, we've got news at our fingertips. It's everywhere. It's in restaurants. It's in airports. It's on treadmills. It's everywhere you go, that we do have to be careful to understand, is this helping us, or is this now negatively impacting us? Mm-hmm. And just like with, the other aspects of technology that I talk about, I think we need to set boundaries sometimes around the news, because so much of it is so negative these days, and people can just really begin to feel, depressed, helpless, ineffective. Whereas this idea of coming together that I talk about in the book, that again, apparently we're doing less of, according to research, especially the younger generations. But this idea of coming together, like in the restorative justice programs, and even in protests, right, that we've seen, actually can be really helpful in kind of down-regulating and creating the sense of what I call a holding environment, based on D.W. Winnicott's work, that really fosters a sense of safety. So really coming back to the idea that secure attachment comes from a feeling of acceptance, a sense that you belong, feeling, we need a tribe, we have to have each other. And so it's really the experience that we have each other's backs. And so I do think this more coming together in person, and not just coming together to hang out, but in real ways, is what's needed.
Yeah. And Meg, and so what is a holding environment?
A holding environment is essentially an environment in which you feel safe and secure, in which you feel understood, in which you feel taken care of. It's based on the idea of quote unquote good enough mothering. I mean, we don't expect people to be, extremely consistent in their parenting. We're human beings. But the holding environment was based on the environment that a child might be in, that is consistent enough, that is present enough for that child, that seeks to understand that child, and therefore creates a sense of safety. So it might be the caregivers, it might be siblings, it might be, we can expand that holding environment, as we grow and develop in time, to be our circle of friends, or our workplace, or, even as I talk about in the book, our nation. So, because we do personify political leaders and countries as attachment figures.
And what would you say is the difference between one's true self and one's persona?
Well, again, I think the true self, these are really complex. We could probably talk for hours about
Absolutely.
it. But simply speaking, the true self is the less defended self. This is why mindfulness is so important, and why I devote a chapter to it, because mindfulness is based on the concept of compassion and non-judgment. And so when we are not judged, when we are compassionately related to, we're more free to be vulnerable. We don't have to have as many defenses. And then our true self, comes out. I mean, so many of my clients are just afraid to be silly, or afraid to have fun, or afraid to dance, let's say, or do things that they're afraid of, being made fun of for, even though that might be something that instinctively they really want to do. That would be the true self battling the persona.
Yeah.
One thing that I liked from that chapter was the example. It was two examples, but there was this client of yours named Larry, who had terrible negative self-talk.
Yeah.
And then when he learned how to practice mindfulness, what ended up happening is he became a little more objective towards that inner voice. Instead of identifying with it, he found that through practicing mindfulness, that he was able to kind of look at that voice, and maybe instead of I might be butchering this, but instead of I am sad, like there is sadness in me, not necessarily.
That's right.
Yeah, not identifying with it, making it like who you are,
Yeah.
but kind of putting this distance between yourself and the emotion, and sort of getting more of a sense of calm and understanding towards oneself. And it was interesting to read where he was before he practiced that, and then where he was after that. And I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's observing your thought processes rather than getting hooked by them.
Yeah, and I was wondering if maybe we could talk about maybe like an example of maybe a way someone could practice mindfulness. Let's say like somebody's listening to this for the first time and they don't know what mindfulness is. Maybe something they can do to practice it.
Yeah, I mean, so people shy away from the word mindfulness often because they attach it to meditation. And, some people have, associations with meditation as being a religion, and they're not interested in that. Other people simply say, I don't have the time to sit and, meditate for 30 minutes. But mindfulness can really be practiced without meditation. It's simply bringing your mind, it's being intentional about where you direct your mind. And in the case of mindfulness, it's bringing your mind to the present moment. I think because if somebody is starting out with mindfulness, probably the easiest way to begin a practice would be to close their eyes so that they don't have visual distraction. And just to sit for 1 minute, let's say, and to follow the breath that moves in and out of the nostrils. And when I say follow it, I mean to just bring their mind to noticing the sensations of the air as the air moves in and out of the nostrils. Now you're bringing your attention to what's happening very specifically in the present moment. On top of that, you're making sure to not judge it. Oh, am I breathing too fast? Maybe I should be breathing, more slowly. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. Those are judgments, and mindfulness really, is free of judgment. It's purely observation, of how the breathing, what's happening with the breath, for example. So that would be like a 1 minute intro practice to mindfulness. If we want to get a little bit more in depth in terms of what people's thoughts are, because, we create our own stress often by, these perceptions we might have about ourselves that are negative. And so if a person is chronically, kind of like Larry, if a person is chronically saying, I'm fat, I'm never going to meet anybody, nobody would ever want to be with me, I'll never have enough money, I'll never, kind of these negative messages that you're constantly barraging yourself with is creating stress response in the system on a regular basis. Because why? Those are threats. And so with mindfulness, we get to kind of back up and take a little bit more of an aerial view. Pause for a minute, and again, I have people close their eyes, although mindfulness can be practiced with your eyes open, and to just observe those thoughts and watch what the mind is doing, seeing it as a thought that's passing through, and not something that's necessarily true or something to identify with. And so even naming it, as, oh, there's critical thought, releasing it and coming back to a place of compassion and non-judgment.
Huh.
Yeah.
You know what's funny? I really wish. For anyone watching, they don't know that Meg can't see us. But actually, while you were doing that 1 minute exercise, I was kind of doing it. As a practice, and I was paying attention to my breathing. And I wish you could see the look on my face. I was like beaming, smiling by the end of it. You know. And
Yeah.
and it's fantastic because what this does is it regulates that stress response in your body, right? The cortisol and adrenaline that kind of build up from chronic stress. If somebody is, and also please correct me if I'm wrong. That is the case, right? That there's a buildup of cortisol and adrenaline if someone's overly stressed, like chronically.
Yeah, it's majorly it's mainly cortisol, and
Cortisol.
yes, it's chronic cortisol production. I'll try to refrain from getting into too much detail, but I guess about the stress response. But we do have adrenaline and we have cortisol, and they're two different hormones, and cortisol kind of comes in after the adrenaline. Adrenaline is the fight flight. It gets us to actually react when we need to, like jumping out of the way of a speeding car. The cortisol comes in to give us the energy that we lost. This is all a matter of seconds, but to give us the energy that we lost as a result, of having to jump out of the way of a speeding car. But when you're under chronic stress, the cortisol keeps pumping up and pumping up, trying to restore the body, and actually creates inflammation in the body. So the mindfulness engages the parasympathetic nervous system via the breathing, which is the calming part of the nervous system. And so that's the idea of reducing cortisol. But the other thing that mindfulness does, and I think this is really key, is that it engages the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that we use to focus on a task. So you can mindfully walk. So we just did a breath exercise focusing on the breath. But you can also walk mindfully. You can eat mindfully. It's paying attention to the task at hand in a very specific, non-judgmental way. And when we do that, it disengages what's called the default mode network. And that's actually the part of the brain that tends to ruminate. What researchers have found, it tends to ruminate negatively about ourselves often. Again, going back to Larry, it's the part of the brain that basically says, I'm too fat, I'll never find a partner. It's the part of the brain that tends to mind wander when we're not focused. And so meditation engages the prefrontal cortex, and when it does that, the default mode network tends to quiet.
Yeah. And it also kind of seems like when you connect with another person, that's also a form of mindfulness. So where it's like you're sort of, when you're kind of meditating, you're kind of, I guess, hyper aware or more aware of yourself and more accepting in the non-judgmental way, obviously, of yourself. But it can also be the same thing when you're in an intimate bond with another person.
Yeah, just being present, right, in a non-judgmental, and I will add compassionate way, know.
And I find that, like, for the most part, that's what all of us struggle with, because we are kind of bombarded most of the time, if not all of the time, with images of perfection from God knows how many areas that most people really sort of struggle to reveal themselves. And something, in terms of, like, let's say, like, existential therapy, which I practice, a lot of what I read about, what the authors describe, is sort of this idea of feeling, or the fear of intimacy, or the fear of kind of finding yourself and kind of revealing yourself. And I found, kind of, not just in terms of my own therapy work, but in terms of just people I've known, that a lot of what we struggle with is that sort of sense of vulnerability, and we feel like we need to be perfect before we're actually accepted by other people. And so the trouble is, because a lot of us are sort of exhibiting personas, that we think that the next person is perfect, and then we're like, oh, now I have to be perfect too, and then the next person, they also thinks that they need to be perfect. And so we all believe that in some ways, based on our social media profiles, that we're perfect, even though none of us are perfect, and it's like the one thing that we're all afraid to reveal.
Exactly.
But what's fascinating about that? Yeah, what's fascinating about that is that's where our commonality lies.
Yes.
Because we're all going through that.
Yes.
So true. Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. I mean, I think one of the things I will say is that with insecure attachment or, with loneliness, like I said before, it's really hard for people to just go out there. It feels like they're throwing themselves to the wolves to go out there and be vulnerable and be themselves. And that's, again, where mindfulness comes in as a vehicle for creating secure attachment. So the good news about attachment theory is that your attachment styles can change. You can change your attachment style. You're not stuck with it the rest of your life. I mean, research has shown that, attachment styles can typically change from one style to another, usually over a period of about 4 years. When you are in relationships, and I'm going to include the relationship to yourself, that is, with a secure individual. And so what I mean by that is, in mindfulness, if you're practicing mindfulness and you're practicing non-judgmental, compassionate attention to the self, you are now in the act of creating a more secure relationship with yourself, one in which you don't feel judged by you, one in which you feel accepted by you, one in which you feel like you've got your own back. And when you're able to establish that, it's going to really help in going out into the world and being more vulnerable with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the thing is, sometimes people kind of, I guess, wonder or are afraid. They think, well, what if I go out into the world and I am rejected for who I am?
Right.
And the thing is, you definitely can be. But the question is, what does that rejection actually mean? So is it that you're rejected because you're inherently flawed or defective, or is it that that person is rejecting you because in some way they're projecting their own insecurities and their own vulnerability onto you?
Correct.
Or you guys just don't resonate.
Well, well, that's if you're like an asshole.
No, sometimes it's not always like a deep-seated neuroses that's going on. Sometimes it's just, I'm interested in this and you're interested in that, so maybe we're just not gonna.
I'm sorry.
Well together.
You're right. But when I say rejected, you're right. I'm sorry. I could have been clearer on
no,
that.
No.
When
I'm
I
just
mean,
adding an extra thing. You said it correctly.
Yeah. No, when I'm saying rejected, I mean like somebody's like, I really don't want anything to do with you. You're like not the person for me, friendship-wise, relationship-wise. I'm sorry. Because when I mean rejection, I mean like harsh rejection. I don't mean like, hey, like I have other things I need to do and we just don't really have common interests. I'm sorry, that's why the nuance there is important.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So my point is that so sometimes it's possible for people to be rejected, and it's not really for the reasons that they think. And it's because kind of like as a society, we're so kind of dead set on being perfect that any sort of hint of imperfection causes us to tremble with intense fear. So it's like if another person is able to be vulnerable with us, that kind of presents to us our own fear of vulnerability, and we're like, oh no, get the hell away from me, I don't want anything to do with this, I don't want to acknowledge my own insecurities. So my question to you, Meg, is how do you think we can sort of begin the process of kind of helping each other understand that like we're pretty much going through the same struggles together, and all of the garbage that we put up on Instagram, that's mostly fake, that these are like kind of the surface level, I guess, the surface level kind of appearances of who we actually fully are.
Right. So I'm always reminded of something that Thich Nhat Hanh said to a child who asked him, I'm being made fun of at school, and what do I do when that happens? And he said something to the effect of, well, you look that person in the eye, which I have to say is an important point here in my book about eye contact. You look that person in the eye and you just say, I'm sorry you're suffering.
Wow.
And he didn't mean that facetiously. He really means that. Because when somebody is critical of us, in some way they are suffering. They're not free. They're struggling with their own judgments. And as you said, earlier, Alen, that the projections that are happening are, highly likely that whatever somebody is criticizing you for is likely how they're feeling about themselves on an unconscious level. So really keeping in mind that when other people say or do unkind things towards you, that it's really coming from their own suffering. And that when you have compassion for other people, even people who might be saying or doing things that are unkind, I'm not talking about abuse, because you do have to draw lines there. I'm not saying just put up with it. But, to have compassion for other people allows you to no longer feel like you're at the mercy of them.
Yeah. Wow. I love that.
Yeah, it makes you less reactive, right?
Yeah, you don't feel, if you have compassion, you realize that they're suffering and that they don't have power over you.
Right, and it's not personal, because that's one of the major problems that I feel like people experience, that they essentially automatically, and this is natural, this is not something that you can just obviously turn off, but we automatically personalize other people's judgments of us. We think just because someone says it or thinks it, that automatically believes that it's true. So
Right.
it's like, what I want, I really hope that kind of our audience takes away from this part of the conversation, is that it's quite possible that another person might perceive that you're any of the things that they say you are, but it's also possible that you're not those things, that it's not so black and white, that just because someone harshly criticizes us doesn't necessarily mean that in the kind of objective sense that we are that thing that that person believes that we are.
Right, and if you're practicing compassion toward the self, if you're, for example, actually saying, you know, Alan, I'm here for you. You know, if you're saying things like that, maybe you have social anxiety and you're going into a big, group of people and you're saying, hey, I'm here for you, and I appreciate you, and those kinds of things. You are calming the nervous system, and you're allowing yourself then to feel more connected to those ideas and less distracted by, and less, what we often say in mindfulness, less hooked by other people's statements.
Mm-hmm. And so, just to kind of shift a little bit, just for time's sake, so there was a part of your book, Meg, that was by far my favorite, and there were definitely a lot of parts to choose from. So it actually reminded me of a show we had, I think it was about 2 months ago, with the rapper, hip-hop legend Napoleon. So the person who we're kind of in touch with, and the person who runs the O4L online network, his name is Vegas. So I remember I read this part of your book, and I actually sent him this quote, and I was like, holy shit, man, it's like literally talking to Napoleon. So and it's like, what's so cool about it is that we're really coming up with these same ideas no matter where we're in, right? No matter whether we're philosophers, psychologists, sort of just your average Joe, whether you're, a hip-hop megastar like Napoleon. It's like a lot of the sort of insights that we come to, which is so cool, is so freaking similar. And so, Meg, I wanted to read this quote, and I wanted to ask you a question about it. So please bear with me because this is a bit long.
It's okay.
Okay. So Meg wrote, and this is in regard to, I don't want to, this is like a bit much in terms of the actual research, but this is in regard to the research of a clinical psychologist. So she wrote that this person's research points to a generational increase in extrinsic goals, such as fame and wealth. Such aims may seem tantalizing in that they connote power and therefore the possibility of more quote-unquote likes, as in terms of social media likes. But in reality, they are merely shiny objects that, when attained, wind up being short-lived band-aids to contentment. Research has always shown that relationships with one another, I mean the real ones, not the digital ones, are what make us happy. Yet teens and millennials seem to be chasing the money/fame dragon, which only results in more stress, as very few people attain either. If they happen to attain their extrinsic goals, these same fame chasers don't actually feel better about themselves. And so, Meg, my question to you is going to be, how come fame and kind of widespread adoration actually doesn't bring about a positive self-image? Like, how is it that when people sort of set the goal of, let's say, fame and wealth, and say to themselves, you know what, I'm going to now feel better about myself, or I'm going to finally feel like I'm enough, that actually doesn't happen when they attain either one or both of those things?
Well, the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic goals, an example of an intrinsic goal might be, I want to, be a good person with other people. I want to, treat people well, let's say. An extrinsic goal might be, I want to make a lot of money. And the reason being is that, we are driven, and there have been many books written about this. I'm reminded of Matthew Lieberman out of UCLA, who wrote the book Social. We are driven, and Bowlby's point in attachment theory is to connect with one another, to find comfort from one another. That is one of the things that helps actually develop the brain, and helps us feel happy, essentially. So, money is fleeting. It's external. But intrinsic goals are not. There are things that, we can be connected to with whomever we are with. And because attachment and because relationships with each other really are the key to our well-being, and that is based on research and probably your own experience, it's proven to be the thing that actually makes us happier. So the old, cliche of money doesn't buy you happiness,
Yep.
Is true. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, well, from my understanding, what you're saying is that, from at least the way I see it, is that the sort of the things that are extrinsic are sort of more fleeting, and it's not something that you can really hold on to. It's like if you don't kind of accept that you temporarily can enjoy it, that if it's something that for you is the pinnacle of your self-esteem, then what's going to happen is it's going to be the seesaw. You get it, you have it, and then you lose it, and you don't. Was that it?
Yeah, it's like when John Kabat-Zinn, says, wherever you go, there you are, right? That if you're with yourself and you've got a secure attachment internally, what's called an internal working model of secure attachment, then you're right. It's not based on the fluctuations externally of everyday life, because that's just a fact.
Yeah.
Our external lives are forever fluctuating, and anything can happen.
Yep.
You can, yeah.
Yeah, plus anyone who's tying their future goal, their happiness to any sort of future goal, like they're saying to themselves, "I'll be happy when, I'll be happy when."
I know.
Yeah, you're training your mind not to be happy now.
Yeah.
Right?
Really good point. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I also think that if you do have a kind of harsh inner self-critic, what happens is a lot of times so the way our kind of minds work is that we're prone as human beings to cognitive distortions and biases. And so if the inner critic is that harsh, what happens is even if you attain those things, it finds a way to disqualify them. It says, oh, well, you're not really that good, or don't you dare think of yourself as being better than you actually are. So it's like, Meg, have you ever seen the film Cool Runnings with John Candy?
Oh my God. I think probably eons ago.
Yeah,
yes. To remind me.
Same as everybody who I ever ask. Yeah. So there was this great quote in the film, and we talked about it a little bit, I think, a few episodes ago. So John Candy is like this disgraced Olympic bobsled coach, and so in the film, the team's captain asks him. He says, like, how come you did it? Like, why did you cheat? You literally had everything you wanted. You pretty much had, kind of fame, and you had fortune. You had the respect of everybody in the Olympic community. Like, you were literally, it's a sort of pinnacle of your profession. And so he essentially says to him, he says, look, man, he's like, having a gold medal is a wonderful thing. But he says, if you're not enough without a gold medal, you'll never be enough with one.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I feel like, right? And I feel like that's sort of...
exactly it.
Yeah, and I feel like that's sort of the pinnacle of what we're talking about when we're talking about chasing fame. It's like people think that it'll sort of silence the harsh critic, but unless you actually sort of deal with why that critic is there, or why you feel like a failure, or why you feel like you're worthless or useless or whatever it is, whatever you attain, that critic will disqualify it. It'll say it doesn't count, it doesn't matter. You're never going to be those things that you want to be, because that's not who you are.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and creates sort of an addiction. You see that with shopping addiction, for example.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow, that's interesting. How so?
Well, people who think, God, I'll be happier if I just have that new, toy.
Right.
And, get the new toy. And then, 3 weeks into it, need the next, better version of that. Because it's not really creating happiness. It's the idea that it will.
Yeah.
It's the idea that these external things will create happiness, will make you feel better if you have these beautiful things around you, or if you've got the fancy house, or whatever it is that you think that you might want. And it's not that those things aren't, I don't mean to downplay, the fact that, yeah, it can be, fun to, strive to buy, a beautiful home or a fancy car or whatever. Yeah. But to, assume that that's actually going to make you happy is where we run amok.
Yeah. And so I also wanted to read another quote by you about, it was about compassion, which I really loved. So you wrote that a plethora of research has emerged on the power of compassion, and that the power that it has on our well-being, including reducing anxiety. The concept is simple, really. If we have compassion for ourselves and others, we free ourselves from the scary burden of judgment. The fear of looking like a fool. So compassion is not selfish. Compassion is not pity. Compassion is understanding oneself or another without criticism. And so we earlier earlier talked about kind of how mindfulness could be used as a tool in order to foster compassion. And so, Meg, I know in your book you talk about a pretty reasonable amount of them. And so what would you say are some of the other important tools for fostering not only self-compassion, but compassion for other people as well?
Well, there's releasing judgment. I mean, that's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I think it's astounding when we pay attention to how many judgments we actually have in any given day about other people or ourselves. And that creates a stress response because it doesn't foster safety. Because remembering that stress is connected to feeling safe, to not feeling threatened. So judgment is a threat. So releasing judgment is one of the biggest things to decreasing stress and certainly fostering compassion. I think, this idea of helping others is also key. So compassion can get you to help others, but you can also get compassion as a result of helping others. So even if you're not, really feeling it or you don't think it's that big of a deal, and I'm not talking about, some big project. I mean, it could be something as simple as, picking up something, a stranger dropped on the street for them. It could be something as, simple as holding the door for, a mom and her baby with the stroller. I mean, little tiny ways of helping people throughout the day have been shown to decrease stress and create a sense of well-being. And then you can get that sense of compassion or connection with other people, because compassion is really about putting yourself in another person's shoes, doing something about it. It's an action.
And would you say that compassion in that sense is sort of regarded or I guess related to releasing judgment? That it's like if you can sort of foster compassion for another person, then somehow that will translate into you kind of, I guess, having a more nuanced understanding of what's going on and why they are the way they are.
Yeah, I think it's bidirectional. I mean, I think you can focus on releasing judgment and thereby, be able to create more compassion. I think you can practice having compassion, and releasing judgment will, go with that.
Yeah. And there was another, do you want to?
No, sure. Go ahead. Okay. I'll say it after.
Well, it was, yeah, okay. So, and there was another tool that I definitely cannot pronounce, but I thought it was pretty much, from my opinion, of course, so the best one in your kind of toolbox. I don't remember what it was called, but you said that it's used by the Zulu people, and I loved it. Can you tell us what that is? How do you pronounce it?
Salbona.
Salbona?
Yeah.
Okay. And what is Salbona?
So that is a greeting. It's a Zulu greeting that when people meet each other that say, "I see you," or translated, "I see you deeply." It's not a "Hey, how you doing?" as we often say in States, kind of off the cuff, and sometimes we really mean it, and oftentimes we really aren't even waiting for the answer. So this is really more of an exchange of "I see you, I know you see me." And the reason that's important is because it has to do, first of all, with eye contact. I talk a lot about eye contact and brain development, and the importance of it, and how we're having less of it because we're looking at our phones all the time, among other things. And that when you look somebody in the eye, you're also practicing mindfulness. You're present. You're really present with that other person. And you're also practicing this concept of, I see you. This isn't about me. I see who you are and what's happening with you. And getting the mind a little bit out of, once again, the default mode network where it's thinking, it's preoccupied with, okay, are my clothes looking okay? Am I right? Am I saying the right thing? Am I, when you're meeting somebody, you're not thinking about that. You're actually focused right there in the present moment, eye to eye on them.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And by the way, to go back to compassion, would you say that, not necessarily synonymous, but would you say compassion and understanding are related in the sense that it brings me back to this quote, actually two quotes. One is, to understand all is to forgive all.
Bill Irwin.
Yeah, from Bill Irwin, yeah. And then another one, seek first to understand, then to be understood. I feel like there's somewhere in there is compassion, at least in the attempt of trying to understand someone.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's about trying to, I mean, you have compassion for another person if you see them in some way. You might not totally understand their suffering or why they're suffering, so you don't have to get it all to have compassion. But you can still see that they're suffering, and that can bring about compassion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the understanding is helpful, but it doesn't have to be there in a specific way.
That's interesting, actually. That actually puts me at ease because, yeah, I suppose to be compassionate, you don't necessarily have to understand. Sometimes it's more of just, how should I say, like just, for instance, like opening the door for the mother and her and the stroller, right? Did you really? I mean, on some level, you do require understanding that, of course, it's not easy to get through the door.
Right.
But barring that, I mean, I suppose you don't really need it in order to show kindness.
And sometimes you can act as if. Remember we talked about that? So sometimes you can even act as if you're compassionate, even if you don't really care about what the other person is going through. And you can actually get this really great result where they say thank you, or, they're sort of full of gratitude. And you can even tell yourself, like, oh, wow, holy shit, like this compassion stuff is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I suppose if you're coming from the frame where you're not feeling compassion initially.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. Actually, one thing I like about what you said, Meg, is that if you do something, some kind of act for someone else, it could kind of foster those feelings of compassion in you after the fact, and I think that's very interesting, actually.
Yeah.
You would think ideally you'd want to just genuinely feel the compassion first, but it's interesting that it works the other way around.
Yeah, because like the way I would think about it is from a developmental perspective. Like, let's say kids a lot of times aren't compassionate, right? Because like that's just kind of what it is to develop, right? And so how do you foster a sense of compassion? A lot of times parents kind of sort of nudge them into doing kind things for others so they could kind of see what the results are. So it's like from our kind of psyche, right? I don't know, I don't want to go into this too much because I don't know enough to say, but for, let's say, a lot of kids, they struggle with being empathic. So it's something that they have to kind of be taught to do. And sometimes the technique that parents use is literally just having them like do nice things for other people just to see what the result is. So if they experience gratitude, if they experience, let's say, somebody giving them something in return because they're so grateful, they can see that sort of being compassionate is much more sort of preferable, on average, obviously, for the most part, than being selfish. Yeah.
I don't, just talking about the teaching of it, granted, yeah, the Z-Gens and millennials, apparently research is showing, do have less empathy. I'm not blaming them for that. I think it has to do with the world we're living in right now. And I talk about that in the book. But as human beings, we, some of Bowlby's work with Ainsworth and Mary Main did show that these little toddlers were instinctively compassionate. If somebody dropped their keys, for example, their instinct was to go over and pick them up and hand them back to the person.
Oh, wow.
That's compassion. That's understanding that person needed those keys. And it's the act of doing something to aid in that person's need. In this case, the need of the keys or whatnot. So you don't have to understand somebody in sense of, oh, well, you're stressed out because you're going to, go on stage and give a speech. And yet, I don't have any problem with that. So I don't know why you're so stressed out. You don't have to understand. You can have a completely different experience to just realize, wow, you're really stressed out right now. And so, here, let me help you.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether you would be stressed out about that thing or not.
Absolutely. And let's say, in the case of children, like let's say there's maybe some parents listening to this show. What would you recommend maybe as far as in relation to maybe screen time or video games or anything really tech related, how maybe they should go about, I mean, and this is a very broad question, so I mean,
that's okay.
Stop me but how they should kind of go about rearing their children, like at what age should they really start using this sort of technology? How should it be kind of like, what kind of boundaries should sort of be placed around it?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I cut you off there. Maybe you didn't finish your question. The at what age? I mean, I would say as long as you can stave technology off, it's a good thing. I think, again, one of the allure these days of your kids having smartphones is that it's ironically does create a sense of safety. It's a lifeline, where your child, can call if in a bad situation. And, there's also tracking, where your child is. For many parents, that creates a sense of ease. So it's not that technology doesn't promote any safety. There are aspects of it that do. But I guess some basic guidelines would be, technology, definitely no video consoles in the bedroom. The research has shown this, but it's just true. I mean, that you can't monitor that, especially at night. Kids can go to bed, but they can get up. And if it's all right there at their fingertips, it's addictive. It's not their fault. It's just addictive. It's an addictive device. And so they're likely to go on it. Same thing with laptops, tablets, smartphones. I just recommend that those things be plugged in at night outside the room to start with. That we get our kids to get good restorative sleep, because they're not these days. And technology gets in the way of them getting sleep. So to set boundaries around place, not having those things in the bedroom, set boundaries around time. I mean, I know this is so hard, especially with teens and homework, but ideally, if kids can be off their devices 1 to 2 hours before bedtime, it really will help with the melatonin onset. It will help with the winding down from the overstimulation of the screen. It will help them get more restorative sleep. When they get more restorative sleep, they're going to behave better the next day. They're going to perform better. But I think the overriding principle, and I do talk about this in the book, is it's such a common experience, and I've fallen into it myself at times, to get frustrated with the teen, get off the device, to get into an argument about it, right? It's a push-pull thing. I'm just finishing a game, or I'm just, just texting this person, or, leave me alone. It's fine. It's not a big deal. And I would try to approach your kids with compassion. It is not their fault. We handed them really addictive devices. We did. And expected them to somehow monitor themselves. And so they're caught, they're struggling. And so we have to compassionately set the boundaries. And it's not about not setting them and saying, oh, that's okay, I understand. It's about, yeah, I'm really sorry, but I have to take the phone now. Because it's too hard to get off of it yourself. It's just too hard. And it's not your fault.
Yeah, I really like that example of there was a child named Alex. Yeah, who couldn't stop playing Fortnite.
That's addictive.
Oh, yeah.
And hey, it's a great game. We understand, sure. But the thing is, it's like he was playing it too much, and he wasn't interacting with the other kids. He'd just kind of be playing there for hours on end. His parents tried to, his mother tried to place a limitation on it. However, it was not successful because I believe he was just entering his preteens, I believe 12 or something like that.
Right.
So he was starting to throw tantrums. And since he was bigger and all that, this was becoming a real problem. Not that it wasn't before, but it's getting even more of a problem, right? So she decides to send Alex to a day camp, I believe during one particular summer.
It was an away camp, an overnight away camp for weeks. I think 4 or 6 weeks, I think it was.
Yeah, and then he began interacting with the other kids there. So we don't know his exact experience there, but when he had come back, he was a changed person. He was calmer. He seemed to let problems like water off a duck's back, like things would not bother him as such. He was less reactive. Yeah, borrowed metaphor. Also, I think it was in the book, something about something off his back. Okay. For sure.
Let things roll off his back, probably.
Exactly.
Okay, but I like your version of it.
What? But yes, the point is that even though it seemed probably from his perspective to be something that was he was probably thinking, I just want to play my video games. probably he's thinking, no, it's okay, or I'm a kid, it's fine. Like, whatever his perspective is, it made sense to him.
Yeah.
And from the parent's perspective, you get it too, because he's spending too much time doing it. So in a way, you can argue like them making that decision was counterintuitive to him, but in the end ended up helping him.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, I guess that's that parental role where you have to make certain choices that are in their best interest, as opposed to that in the moment, whatever is their logic or sophistry that they're kind of putting out there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, say it's already 9 o'clock or something, they have to be in bed 10:30, 11, and you have the rule, like, you don't use your phone for an hour to 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
If they say, oh, I'm just texting and all that, it's hard to argue with that logic.
Mm-hmm.
They're thinking, oh, it's okay, whatever it is I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
But then you got to understand the parent side of it, right? Where it's like, I'm really trying to show you the right way, and these things have such a hold on you that we have to do it this way.
I hear you.
And I don't know.
Well, the other thing is, with regard to addiction, any kind of addiction, you can tell somebody not to drink or not to watch the news after they come home from work or whatever, but you need to get them to be able to, engage in doing something else during that time when they would normally be drinking or watching the news. I'm just using those as examples of things we can get addicted to. And the same thing goes with technology. And in Alex's case, it wasn't just that they sent him away and took, the camp didn't allow any technology, but they put him in nature, which I talk about a lot in the book, and in outdoor activity, which then he found a new tool to engage his boredom, because it's all started with I'm bored, right? He's an ADHD kid. And, that really changed him. He actually begs for that camp every year still. I think he's 14 now, or 13, maybe 13, 14. And it's because he found, other ways of stimulating, his brain and his body, other than the video games. And so sometimes it's if we just focus on taking it away, it's harder. But if there's replacement, like, hey, let's go down to the basketball court, or, let's get outside and ride your bike, and, things like that. The kid might not want to do it at first, but ultimately that becomes a good tool, and actually simultaneously a stress relieving tool for them if it's exercise or being outside in nature.
And so what's really cool now that I'm thinking about it is that we're actually doing this episode today and not last week. So because I have a story to share with one of my clients that I wouldn't have had last week because I actually...
Cool.
Yeah, right? So, so what I also think in terms of kind of solutions is that we need sort of more leaders, right? And we need more leaders in the sense of having more people to kind of be open and vulnerable and being able to be who they are. And so, interestingly, yesterday I had a session with one of my clients he's much younger. He's a college student. And so a lot of what we work on is kind of self-acceptance and kind of letting go of the value of being sort of popular or kind of famous, right? For, I guess, more kind of shallow or more sort of reasons that have to do with kind of societal expectations, right? So he was telling me the story, and which was like it really just blew me away. He's like this really unique kid, right? And so he kind of like the way he dresses, the way he looks, is very unique. So he's like you can see it if you ever like saw this person on the street. It's like it's very obvious that he stands out. And so when he was in high school, he was like picked on for it. And so for him, the kind of internal struggle is, do I kind of do I sort of behave and act and dress the way I want to in a way that makes me feel comfortable with me, or do I sort of try to meet societal expectations to fit in and kind of be accepted within, I guess, kind of, let's say, not necessarily the group, but like the popular group. Mm-hmm. And so he told me the story, and he said, as I was struggling with this, he said, I still have these acquaintances in high school, and some of them came up to me or, kind of texted me or just told me in different ways. They said, hey, because you were who you were in high school, I was able to be who I was. And so one person actually told him, who was a transgender girl, she said she ended up kind of coming out and being who she thought that she actually was because he was the trendsetter for her. And I thought that was like so amazing.
Wow.
Like, here's this kid who's like struggling with his self-image, and yet he's a leader for all of these other people who felt like they couldn't be themselves. And so in his mind, right, so amazing. And so in his mind, he's thinking like, oh my God, I'm not good enough because I don't meet this standard or this expectation. And yet for other people, they're like, oh my God, dude, without you, I would have never been the person that I was.
Wow.
I know, that's that power of being honest with each other, right? I mean, gosh, that's a great story.
Yeah, wow. And I got to tell him about this so you can watch it. But like, I would have never had it last week. You know, like Napoleon and them say everything happens for a reason. Yeah. This is literally it.
Right, there we go. Right.
Yeah.
All right.
And by the way, see, I almost wanted to do this earlier, but in the interest of time, So I want to go back to meditation and mindfulness for a moment, just to kind of highlight what are some of the benefits of it. Because one thing I love is the way you framed why mindfulness and meditation is important in Chapter 3. Because something about... So here's the thing. There is that stigma associated with meditation. Like it's a woo-woo thing, or belongs to a particular religion, or this or that. And I like how you actually kind of framed it in a way where, no, it doesn't have to be that. And it's not that, actually. It's more about paying attention to what's going on inside and out there. And even you can be in meditation with someone else or by yourself. And there was this, so some of the things that it helps, meditation, is sharpens your cognitive skills, improves your working memory, decreases anxiety and depression, decreases blood pressure, makes us feel more connected to ourselves and to others, increases a sense of well-being, and decreases stress. Now, what's great is kind of how it comes full circle, is by reducing stress, you're able to sort of build up a secure attachment, one in relationship to yourself and to others. And if more people meditated, that can have cascading effects societally, actually.
That's a good insight.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I really think this idea of mindfulness in schools is so key. If we get kids to learn meditation at a younger age, I mean, David Lynch has a program called the Quiet Time Program. He's been doing this. And the results are extremely positive. It really, I agree. I absolutely agree. It could help society immensely.
And one thing it's not like it's just an option anymore. I feel like it's actually almost a necessity, given how overly stimulated we are.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So since it's a necessity, that's why, like, for example, I value books like these, because it kind of, how should I put it? It's pointing out something that I'm going in circles. Yes, it's something that's necessary, right? It's not something that we can just let the progression of technology and social media kind of take its course. Because if we do without really intervening, already the momentum is insane with how much momentum it's gotten. But it's definitely necessary to teach things like this, and I think it should eventually be kind of mandatory in schools.
I hear you.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
All right. So we have finally come to the end of the road.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much for coming on. I thought this was such an insightful and enlightening episode.
It's great to talk with you.
Well, Alan, final questions, thoughts, comments?
Well, actually, yeah. If we wanted to follow you, let's say on social media, where could we find you?
Yeah, so my website is megvandeusen.com. That's MEGVANDEUSEN.com. My Twitter handle is @DrVanDeusen. And my book is on Amazon right now. Stressed in the U.S.
And she's talking about this book, Stressed in the U.S., 12 Tools to Tackle Anxiety, Loneliness, Tech Addiction, and More.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've already gone through so many parts of it, and Meg, it's so phenomenal.
You should have seen my notes. My notes and what we talked about. It's hilarious, the difference.
Oh, yeah, no, same here. Yeah, there were a lot of things that we didn't focus on. I actually had stuff.
Oh, I know.
It's okay. I figured that would happen.
No, I mean, that's good.
Right. I know we could talk a long time.
Yeah, I actually had notes on kind of sort of how it affects brain chemistry, memories, connection to secure attachment style. Yeah,
Right.
and the story that you had when you talked about being 1 year old and having that memory.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, can you mention that before we go? That's actually a really cool story. The memory that you have when you were 1.
Yeah, I know, it's very bizarre.
Uh-huh.
It's not common to have memories that young.
Yep.
I'm assuming I was around 1. I was in a crib still, so I could have been anywhere up till 2, I guess. But I remember, being very scared and terrified. Really, waking up being very terrified. The room was dark, and I remember coming into the room. I remember the sensation. So early memories, you really do remember sensation because you don't have any verbal yet. And I remember the sensation of being picked up. Later, I learned that this was my father, and this would happen quite frequently, that he would come in. And when I was picked up and held in his arms, and I remember the perspective changing from the ceiling to the wall, because now I was upright in his arms. Just this sense of calm and ease and well-being, and the fear went away. I just remember the emotional feeling and the physical feeling of that. And then I remember the feeling of being put back down again in the crib, I guess, and that kind of terror happening all over again. So the picking up and the putting down, I wasn't obviously ready to be put back down again, I suppose. But that is just an example of how we begin to create secure attachment. I'm terrified. I'm a baby. It's just, where am I? What is this? I have a sensation, a feeling in my body of being scared. And these loving arms come, literally holding me, creating a sense of ease. I'm here for you. I get it. I understand. I have your back. And that's palpable to me, that memory.
Yeah, lovely.
Wow.
All right, Meg, thank you so much again for coming on today.
Okay, thank you guys.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. That was a very cool episode.
Super enlightening. All right, guys, so you know where to follow us. You found us.
Follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Instagram and on Facebook, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter.
Yep.
Remember to subscribe.
Hit the bell.
And this is our 30th episode.
Yeah.
Look forward to the next one. See you guys next week.
See ya.